Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about Crucible of Gold by Naomi Novik. So it's been a while since I read a Temeraire book, because I knew that I would want to buy the next one as soon as I finished this book, and I couldn't afford to buy books. So it was just sitting on my TBR being like, nope, you can't touch that one, you can't touch that one. Though it did help that the last Temeraire book that I read, the previous one, Tongues of Serpents, I just didn't find it quite as compelling as all the rest of the series, so I didn't feel the immense pressure to read this one, but I knew I wanted to read something relatively quick and that I knew I would enjoy, so I finally pulled this one out, and proving that I was right, I also have already ordered the next book in the series, even though no, I should not be buying books right now. But this is the seventh book in this series, and so as usual, I will warn that there are going to be spoilers for the previous 6 books in this review. I will try to avoid spoilers for this book. I always do, and try to at least warn you before I give a spoiler, but it's going to be hard to talk about something this far along the series without revealing what came before. So if you have not read through book 6 of the Temeraire series, and plan to, maybe go ahead and set this review aside, go back and watch the review for book 1, and then come back to me when you're ready. Okay, so Crucible of Gold starts with Lawrence and Temeraire in Australia, living relatively peaceful in semi-willing retirement. Then an old questionable ally, the diplomat Hammond, shows up with a letter. He is here to offer Lawrence reinstatement in the Aviator Corps, with the caveat that his first orders will be to go to Brazil and try to save the Portuguese royal family from an invasion of the Swana dragons. So Napoleon has been shipping these African dragons to Brazil, promising them the chance to save their people who have been victims to the slave trade. This is a huge problem for the British in this particular book because they are hoping to march troops through Portugal to attack France, and that means helping the Portuguese in Brazil so that the Portuguese will let them and be there to defend their troops. Lawrence is wary about all this mission because he has been surprisingly happy in exile. Also, he knows that he is only being re-enlisted because he has some contact with the Swana Dragons and so is a better diplomat than anyone else they have on offer. And also, he knows that his re-enlistment will probably just be throughout this mission. He has no faith whatsoever that he won't be sidelined as soon as this mission is over. But the biggest barrier to him taking on this mission is he's an abolitionist. He fully supports the idea of the enslaved people in Brazil being freed, and he knows that his role as a mediator there is not supposed to be one fighting for abolition. He just has no interest in saving the slave trade. But duty, combined with the hope that he will be able to negotiate from an abolitionist standpoint, convinces him to go ahead and return to the military and to the war. Everything will go wrong long before they even reach South America, and all Lawrence and Temeraire can do is try to save as many lives as possible. Okay, so the first thing I just cannot help but mention, the back of the book blurb starts with "the French have invaded Spain," which bothered me a good bit. Because, like, yeah, I assume the French have invaded Spain, like, it logically has happened, and I think they might have mentioned battles in passing, but I'm 100% sure that nowhere in this novel does it ever simply state France has invaded Spain. No, the impetus of the story is Portugal. Like, the English want to land troops in Portugal, not Spain. And, like, the reason Lawrence is being sent to Brazil is because Brazil is a Portuguese colony, and so they need to settle and, like, neutralize Brazil before they can deal with Portugal. This is all about Portugal, not Spain. And, like, yeah, presumably the English want to land in Portugal to march up through Spain, but it comes across sort of as whoever wrote the back of the book blurb either did not know the difference between Spain and Portugal or assumed that most readers wouldn't know the difference between Spain and Portugal. And I don't feel that that's correct. This is basic geography. But that's one of those stupid little pedantic things that should not matter. I just get distracted by them and feel the need to talk about them. But overall, to the actual book, I really liked this book. I feel like it's a bit of a return to the more norm of the Temeraire series. Like, I know I talked in my review of Tongue of Serpents that book felt a little bit like it wandered in from a different genre. Like, a lot of it felt rather directionless and plotless. Like, there's a lot of stuff happening, but it feels more like a travel journal than an actual novel until pretty much the very end of the book. This one is right back to being the much more linear early 19th century war story with dragons. And like, one thing that has been a mark of this series from the very beginning is there are definitely elements of every single book that are things that definitely needed to happen for the overall series, but didn't necessarily need to happen where they happened in the books. So there always have been these standout moments that are just sort of like, okay, and then that happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But overall, the books have a driving force, a driving impetus, driving themes, and this book very much returned to a lot of the themes that are very important to this series. Namely themes of enslavement, freedom, rights, loyalty, and honor. So this book we get to see also the Inca Empire, which is cool. And in this version of history, because of course we are in very much at this point alternative history, the Inca Empire in the early 1800s is still a powerful empire. They are dealing with the plagues that the conquistadors brought to their doorsteps, but they are still a standalone empire. They are presented a bit like Japan as isolated by choice, not allowing foreigners to land in their ports, though they do trade, like, offshore. They're not allowing ambassadors from other world powers to come. They are sort of relying on their geography and their dragons to keep them safe by being kept away from everybody else. And I really don't know much about the Inca Empire. That's one that I really have very little knowledge about. So I'm not going to be able to weigh in on how historically accurate / historically inspired this portrayal of the Inca people are. I know that Quipu, the system of keeping record, was the main system of recording language in the Inca Empire, but that's literally pretty much all I know that turns up in this book. So I cannot give you an estimate on to whether or not any of it's accurate. But what I absolutely loved here is the way that Naomi Novik has painted all these different nations as having sometimes subtly different relationships and sometimes wildly different relationships with the dragons in their society. And that has been established throughout all the different books. Like, it's not, like, introduced here. We know from the beginning that in England, dragons are thought of as nothing more than animals. They are to be feared and controlled. People are surprised that they actually can hold down conversations and can do math and things like that. Whereas in China, they're semi-sacred. They are granted the rights of citizens, they can live independently, they can hold down jobs, they can own property, and are expected to be respected. In Swana, they are revered ancestors, believed to be the reincarnations of respected members of individual tribes. And now we get to the Inca, where the relationship is once again subtly different. The Inca dragons collect people that they consider part of their village / family. And it's very clear that they see themselves as owning the people, and that they are the political heads of these, like, families. In fact, it's set up as a bit of a misunderstanding when the English first end up on their shore, that they think the dragons are basically practicing slavery with the humans, and it takes a while for the subtle distinction of what's actually happening to come to light. And what the distinction is, yeah, they feel possession towards them, they feel possession towards people the way that we feel possession towards other members of our family. They protect them, they do let them make their own choices. There is the problem of dragons stealing people from other families, but it's clear that is seen as a problem and about the fact that dragons are being a bit too possessive. But what I love here is that it also becomes clear to the humans in this book that their English dragons have always sort of felt this way as well. Like, Temeraire does not think of himself as, you know, a possession of Lawrence. Temeraire thinks of himself as owning Lawrence. And the English officers make passing comments about how they need to get away from the Inca before they further corrupt the English dragon's thinking. But the only actual change in thinking we see is Timur slowly realizing that he can lay claim to more than just Lawrence. Like, he could have an entire crew, an entire tribe, maybe all those 200 sailors. Maybe they're all his. But the thing is, throughout the book, Naomi Novik has been showing us moments that stress the fact that the English dragons have always thought of their captains as being possessed by the dragons. Like, especially early on in the book, before we even meet the Inca, there are moments where the dragons are being super overprotective and super possessive. And it's really more just going to the Inca Empire and hearing it phrased that the dragons are owning the people, that it just basically comes to a head that that's what's going on. They finally realize their dragons' feelings. And the revelation that their dragons do really think of them as possessions drives all the captains to lay down their own boundaries, to remind their dragons that they are not actually possessions. And it all adds up to this really interesting examination of attachment, of codependency, of balance, and relationships. It's also fabulously played with when we do finally get to Brazil and we get to see the cultural clash between the Swana and the Portuguese. There are just a couple of beautiful moments where we get to see the power of understanding the nuances of other cultures and how it affects the interaction between peoples. There are moments where some of the people think that they are winning, and if they just understood what they were saying to the other culture, they would know that they are actually losing this negotiation. Because they don't understand this other group's culture, they don't understand that they are shooting themselves in the foot. I also want to talk about action here. There are only a few fight scenes in this book, but they are fun, they are very clear, they are exciting, and as always, there are some casualties that are absolutely brutal. And there's also a really interesting portrayal of an explosion in here. I will say it was a section I had to read 3 or 4 times to figure out what was going on because it was so sudden. And I mean, that was clearly on purpose, but I do wish there had been some clarification just like later on in that chapter. But on the casualties, it's interesting how one of the most important deaths in this book is handled. It felt like for a good portion of the book, I'd say over 100 pages, that it was almost forgotten by both the characters and the book itself. Like, the tone just completely went to rather light and playful, and every now and then there'd be that moment of a relatively important character died. Are we going to pay attention to that? And it's just very rarely brought up, and it's only brought up in passing. And then there's this absolutely terrible gut punch moment when they have to directly talk about it. And it's another really interesting exploration of the weight of war. I've always found it very interesting in this series of books because these books are set in a time period where war is often treated as little more than games by the people who are involved. And these games are controlled by very strict rules, a code of conduct, a set of honorable ways of committing war. And that really dehumanizes war in a very real way. It gets rid of all the, messier emotions, the grieving, the horror, the distaste for it. And in this book in particular, several of the characters are very clearly seeing war in that gamified way. Some of the characters are set up as pawns, their desires fully set aside, and basically their humanity set aside, so that they can become physical flags claiming space on the game board. Also, there's an absolutely beautiful moment where one of those characters who was sort of pawnifying the other characters, in turn gets his own will and desire and thoughts completely set aside, so that he can be cornered into something that's going to help him be a tool to his nation, but is completely against anything he personally would want. And I like that contradiction. That reversal was very nicely done. But also, this intense code of honor and Lawrence in particular's constant obsession with what he sees as proper gentlemanly behavior clashes so hard against that constant, violent death that has been presented throughout the series. Like, Naomi Novik has never like shied away from the violence of this war. Like all these books have shown horrific death, and there have been some relatively big name characters who die throughout the series. And to a modern reader, it feels so weird to have Lawrence sit down to dinner, have polite conversation, light banter with people who are responsible for the deaths of some of his friends and allies. And I really like the fact that that disconnect is clearly beginning to weigh on Lawrence as a character himself in this book. I mentioned there was that moment when the death that had seemed largely forgotten pops back up and is such a gut punch. And part of the reason it is such a gut punch is because there is a moment where decorum is set aside and humanity breaks in. And that scene ends with Lawrence staying up to see if the person who just lost someone who really matters to them wants to come talk about it, and they don't. There's this shifting of balance between the emotionless, cold rules of engagement and the humanity behind the war. And for one of the first times in this series, Lawrence is standing on the side opposite of the rules of decorum. And if Empire of Ivory, I think it's third, fourth book, made Lawrence really question whether his loyalty was more for king and country or just straightforward, what is the right thing to do? This book feels like it's a major step in his journey of questioning the rules of honor that he had been taught and has lived by his entire life, and whether they outweigh humanity. And I actually meant to stop talking about themes and get back to a simple evaluation of the book, and I got distracted. I apologize. So let's try that one more time. This book brings in some LGBTQIA representation into the series. A character comes out as gay, and it's a wonderfully ridiculous circumstance. It's a really cute little scene. It's also a character that I've gotten vibes off of, so yay, I'm good at picking gay characters. And I loved the really stupid shit in this, like there's some time period appropriate terminology that I appreciate it being used here. I love the fact that Lawrence is fully aware that queer people do exist, has incorrect assumptions about them, but he doesn't really make an ass of himself. And he's embarrassed, but we get the feeling that has more to do with that he's just having to talk about sex, and he's not comfortable talking about sex, and it doesn't really have much to do with the fact that it's about two men. But overall, it's a really cute scene, and it makes me like a specific character even more. There's also a life-altering injury in this book that I don't feel was quite treated as seriously as it really would be in real life. Like, the character just recovers what feels like far too quickly, in my opinion, and seems surprisingly blasé about this. But it also happens late enough in the book that it might just be that the majority of the arc surrounding that injury is going to show up in later books. Who knows? I haven't talked much about Temerary's arc in this review, because I feel like his arc is it takes a bit of a back seat to Lawrence's arc in this book. It is still there. Both there's the continuation of his overarching arc throughout the entire series, his search for freedom, his understanding of what loyalty means, and all that sort of stuff. But there's also a book-specific arc for him here. But his book-specific arc is largely one of jealousy and a bit more of a relationship developing with Iskirka, however you say her name, and I don't really like her as a character, and I wasn't super interested in that relationship developing, and while I do really like the fact that that relationship really still comes across as very aromantic but not asexual, it's a very interesting relationship, but I just didn't care for the overall arc there. I was really only interested in the part where Temeraire has concern about eggs, like that was fascinating, but overall his arc wasn't as interesting to me in this book as Lawrence's was. Other than that, this was a really fun book. One of the things that I love about the Temeraire series is it manages to have a overall light, fun, playful tone, while being, linguistically heavy because it is written in a voice that is at least reminiscent of the time period, but it's also, thematically incredibly heavy. But overall, I find the books more fun than, heavy. This book is not going to end up on my top list of books of the year, but I enjoyed every minute of reading it. The descriptions were absolutely lovely, especially the descriptions of the Incan dragons. I loved the description of those dragons. I want them all. They are beautiful. I love these dragons. The characters are fun, and the development of the characters that we see is very fulfilling. The action is integrated and enjoyable. Like, that was one of my problems with Tongues of Serpent, that the action felt sort of tacked on at the end. It was sort of like, oh, we haven't had a fight scene. Here's a battle. And in this book, it really felt like it worked. It made sense. My only problem with the conclusion climax seed battle is, why is the incredibly injured character involved? But we are pretty far away from real history at this point, so I no longer feel that intense compunction to think deeply about the relationship between fiction and history that so many of my Temeraire reviews have boiled down to. I'm still really fascinated by the way Napoleon is used as a character in this book. Like, just his relationship to the reality of Napoleon, his arrogance, the fact that in many ways he did stand for, skills being raised up and, like, social mobility, but at the same time, he basically started World War I, just an earlier version of World War I. And I do like the fact that the Temeraire series has changed the Napoleonic Wars from being, I mean, some people could have called them World War, except for the fact that it was mostly Europe, to no, really, this is a world war. Everyone's getting involved. Like, at this point, we have pretty much every world power, and some of them are world powers that in the real world were not world powers by this point. All of them are involved. And basically, this is just a really solid entry in the Temeraire series. It's definitely worth the read. It's made me excited to pick up the last two in the series. I am very happy, and I also, this is a stupid thing, I'm glad this is a series that has a definitive end, because I am getting to the point that I'm like, I'm enjoying this. I know I will not be enjoying this if this kept on for another 5 books. There are 2 books left, and that feels like a good, solid number to have a completion at. So, I'm really excited to get the last 2 books in the series. It's going to be a while before I can read the next one, because it's on back order, and I have no idea when it will arrive. But hopefully, relatively soon, I will have read all the Temeraire books. Yay.